Hi, thanks for hanging out. In this video, you'll see how I go about making this multi-grip chin-up bar. Let's get after it. This project started with a mate of mine asking if I could make him a custom-sized multi-grip chin-up bar for the squat rack in his home gym. Checking and having enough material to use, I said of course. The tube I'm using was salvaged from a fence the neighbour and I pulled down and has now been used for a few projects. After cutting off the mesh that was welded to the tube, I'm grinding off the leftover weld. The tube has some paint, grime and some spots of surface rust that the wire wheel will remove and clean up. After this, I've got 3 or 4 good pieces to cut all the parts from. Soon you'll see how I laid out the design for the main bars. To get the shape that I want, I'm notching the main bars to create a relief that will let me put a bend in the bars and then they'll get welded together. I wanted a smoother curve at the bend, which is why I tried this rather than a clean cut and join. It ended up working really well. I think if you had a tube bender, you could get a similar result. I traced the shape of a commercially available lap pull-down bar onto my workbench to get an approximate width and angle for the bars. I used this to work out the angles for the relief cuts you just saw. After cutting the bars and checking them, the hand position felt very comfortable even though they were angled slightly more than the template. These tubes were galvanised, which when welding produces a pretty nasty smoke. Even though I wear a respirator to weld, I'm grinding the surface clean before welding. These are now ready to tack and weld together. I made sure that there was a good heavy bead of weld right the way around the relief cut to give me plenty of steel to grind away and leave a smooth transition over the bend. Because I had a good amount of weld in these corners, I was able to take my time with the flat disc and grind these back to a really nice smooth bend for the main bars. I think these turned out quite well. The transition is nice and smooth and they're comfortable to grip. The length of tube I had for the second bar wasn't quite long enough to bend the same way I did for the first bar. For this bar I had to make clean cuts and join the pieces back together. I was able to use the first bar as a template to make sure the angles were right before tacking it up. After the first few tacks, I needed to give it a small tweak to get it straight before welding it out. Even though this bar was welded differently to the first, I made sure there was plenty of weld on the join to grind off, which still gave me a nice smooth transition and comfortable grip. Here I'm using an offcut of equal angle, which will make the two ends of the chin-up bar. It was a 600mm or 2 foot long offcut that was perfect when cut in half. Both main bars will join to this and it will sit on top of the main bar on the squat rack while it's bolted in place. There's an existing bolt on the squat rack we'll use to secure one end of these brackets. I'm marking this out with an automatic centre punch. I want the chin-up bar to be reversible and the length of these two brackets is slightly different. To make sure that the holes are the exact same distance apart, I've clamped them together in the vise while I drill the holes. I've used a smaller pilot drill before stepping up to the finished hole size. The width of the squat rack bar that this is being installed on is not as wide as these brackets. To make this look neater when it's installed, I'll trim off one side of this equal angle with a cut-off wheel and dress it up on the sander. While I'm at it, I'll smooth off the corners and add a little bit of shape to these brackets. Before I weld these on, I'm taking the time to remove all the mill scar with the flap disc. This will help when welding and give me a good clean surface to paint later. I've gone back to my template to line up each bar, cut them to length and at the right angle to make sure they are welded to the brackets square and level. The two main bars are different diameters. To get them centered to one another on the end brackets, I'm scribing a center line on each bracket which will help to align them perfectly. I'll prep the ends for welding by grinding off the galvanizing. This off-cut block of timber happened to be the perfect height to sit the bracket on and line it up with the first main bar. Once that was measured and tacked in place, it made lining up the second bar much easier, and I just had to remember to take into account the different diameter when checking the offset from the end of the bracket. When the first bracket was tacked, I carefully flipped this around to tack on the second bracket. The tacks on the underside caused the brackets to twist away from the top just a little bit. To close up the gap while I tacked the top in place, I used a ratchet strap to pull this together tight. This worked really well and I got a good flat fit between the end of the main bars and the brackets. Both bars now get fully welded in place. The main structure is now together and looks great. Before I put in all the smaller pieces, I'm taking the time to grind all the surfaces clean because it'll be much easier with this extra space now than trying to work around all the smaller parts later. I chose to use a hole saw to cut the notches for the smaller crossbars, which worked out great and gave me a very neat fit and finish. The hole saw size I used was to fit the larger of the two bar diameters. The small gap left when fitting to the slightly smaller bar wasn't an issue. I had to really take my time with this because this was at the very limit of what this small drill press could handle. I could have just as easily made these notches with a flap disc, and I did use that technique for the 45-degree bars you can see on the finished product, and with some time the result was just as neat. Some cleanup on the grinder and these are ready to install. Here I'll do a quick test fit to make sure everything lines up the way I want it to. Perfect, very happy with how that's worked out. I took the time to clean up all the crossbars before welding them into place. Now I'm getting them in between the main bars and in their rough final position. I do have some pencil marks as a guide to line them up, then I'll finalise the position with the tape measure and some gentle taps with the hammer before tacking them in place. Now that everything's tacked in place, time to fully weld it out and clean it up before paint. I'm using the die grinder and wire wheel to get the last of the welding slag out of these joints, and then it's on to painting. The painting rack I made a couple of videos ago sure has come in handy, and this is perfect for hanging the chin-up bar while it gets painted. I'll start with some wax and grease remover and go over the whole thing thoroughly before using some compressed air to dry it and blow off any remaining dust or lint. The primer I chose for this project is a primer filler, and this was for a few reasons. I wanted to use something that would fill in the scratches from the flap disc I used to clean up all the surfaces. It'll be indoors and rust won't be as much of a concern, and it's something new to try and learn about for future projects. The other new thing I tried was the spray can trigger handle that can attach to most spray cans. For this particular product, it didn't work very well at all. The spray pattern was too wide, and I ended up with more primer on the can than on the project. Once I took that off and went back to the old finger trigger, it went on a lot better. Overall, the coverage and finish was really good. Once the primer filler had dried completely, I took some 400 grit sandpaper and gave it a very light sand to smooth out the surface. I went very gently over the whole surface because the primer was very easy to sand off. After that, it was back onto the painting rack and a quick blow off with compressed air and wipe down with a dry shop towel before the top coat. For the top coat, I chose a more conventional corrosion inhibiting metal surface paint in matte black. Working around this a few times and it really started to look great. And that's this project all done. The paint is dry now and I'm really happy with how that's turned out. I chose matte black to be able to give a little bit of extra grip as opposed to a gloss paint, which I felt might get a little bit slippery if your hands were wet, and I'm satisfied with how that's turned out. The width of this overall was governed by the power rack that this is going to get installed in, and I took a cue from the bend in a commercially available lat pull down bar for where I would make the transition between the straight and the angled pieces for you to be able to put your hands on. Similarly is the width of the handles in the center of the bar itself. This is a close grip pull down handle for a lat pull down machine, and the distance between these two bars is exactly the same distance as between those on there, so I feel like that will give you a good comfortable grip when you're doing chin-ups. I ended up with two different thickness bars for the front and the back, mostly because that's what I had to be able to make this project from. The side benefit is that this will help improve your grip strength with a larger bar diameter. When deciding which way to angle these 45 grips in the middle, I chose to put them the way that I did so that you had a good close grip, at least on the smaller bar, if you wanted to do a close grip chin up or something similar. If I was to do a similar project to this again, one thing that I would like to work on is the quality of the look of the welds. I know they're plenty strong enough, they look a little bit daggy though, and they took a bit to clean up. I think even though I'm using the cheapest gasless MIG that I could get on Amazon, I've still got some room to improve, and so for the next project I'll be spending some more time practicing and getting the voltage and the feeds right to get a better result. Overall, I'm really pleased with how this has turned out. I hope you enjoyed the video, perhaps got something out of it or an idea to try yourself. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave those below, and remember, until next time, life's short, so get after it.